Greetings. I'm Nancy Breath. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. on a topic we all love and hate at the same time, technique. Let's see if we can talk a little bit about how technique can actually be given to our students without tears. What is technique anyway? There are lots of different definitions of it. I came across one really interesting not very long ago in a New Yorker article about a dancer. Now, dance is a field like ours that requires years and years of preparation, years and years of working on technique. So I like this application. It was an article about the tap dancer, Savion Glover. And here's a photograph of his feet in his beautiful tap shoes. And the writer said about him, Savion Glover is a perfect illustration of the relationship between technique and art. He can do more things faster and more clearly than any other tapper. That alone won't make you an artist. But if art is where you're headed, such an endowment frees you. I like that idea of technique being something that frees us to be what we really want to be. And this is how Savion Glover puts it himself. I try to keep my chops up so I can just be. Technique has kind of a bad rep, I think, in general. Students may think of it as boring, as dull, as I wish we didn't have to do this. Well, just like dancers, we do have to do it. We have a lot of incredibly complex music to master, and it takes some physical technique to do that. I don't know if you remember the old-fashioned saying of woodshedding. When I was little, the teachers used to say, you need to woodshed this. My students hardly understand that, but I tell them, you know, there are still places in the world where actually people have to chop wood to heat their house. And chopping wood takes a long time and it's hard to do, but it's absolutely necessary. And that's kind of like technique. It does take time. It does take effort. But if we are careful about the way we present it and what we present, we can make it interesting or even, dare I say, fun, so we can avoid the sighs and the rolled eyes and the boredom and the tears. Now, there are various technique building systems that we use. Sometimes we use several, sometimes we focus on one. I grew up in the exercises we create school of thought. So my teacher excerpted a part of a piece I was working on and gave me an exercise that I would drill at home in order to perfect that excerpt. Those are the exercises we create. And I think because of that upbringing, the writing that I've done in my life has pretty much concerned the same way of practicing. So I've written a lot on practicing itself. But the truth is that what I'm writing is mostly about building technique. The publications for students to use in their practicing really have a lot to do with repetition, because repetition is absolutely necessary. It's like the chopping wood. You have to keep at it and keep doing the same thing over and over. However, it occurs to me that we don't have to bore ourselves to death doing it. So what I've tried to do is to think up ways or to remember ways that I learned or to listen to ways that my friends and my students tell me that we can repeat things and actually enjoy doing it. I have an illustration of this from the practice guide for students. There is a tip called button up, which I have used for years as a kind of a trick to get people to repeat things without getting too upset about it. I have happen to have a big button box inherited from my mother, so I use that, but you can use coins or you can use candies or anything of that type. And the idea can be illustrated by this little girl who's going to show you how to do button up. Resume. Try that one again. Remember, Freddie jumps forward. Beautiful.
The last one.
Not quite the last one.
Oh.
Aside from exercises that we create ourselves, of course, there are exercises that other people create for us. We have also etudes, and we have technical regimens. I think most of us have some combination of that in our background. I had a probably summer experience when I was in high school. I remember that in the summer we did a special sort of session on scales, a race to 160 for your scales and whatever for your arpeggios. And that was, of course, helpful. However, in later years, when I was performing a lot and having to learn music fast and furious, I found myself a little bit on the edge technically. And even later on, when I became more of a teacher than a student, you know, I noticed the same thing in my students. They played very musically. It was always a pleasure in that respect, but I felt they were a little bit insecure technically. So I looked and tried to find various different systems over the years to augment their sense of security. So my goal today is to show you some of those publications that I found that really helped me in doing that. I mentioned the practice tips, and one of them that I like a lot is kind of stolen from this book, Technique Builders. So for example, I call it baby steps. If somebody is doing, let's say, an ornament, and it's not too easy, or learning new fingering on the ornament, then I ask them to do it like this, in baby steps. That's much more interesting to do than playing it 7 or 8 times all by itself. And that's the principle that you find in this very interesting book by Hazel Cobb, an old book, but one which I really recommend to modern teachers and students. It's called Technique Builders. When I first came across this book in a music store, I had never seen it before. I picked it up for a couple dollars and took it home. When I sat down at the piano and opened it up, I started to play, and I played the whole book because it was just fun to play. So I said, oh, this is a hint. I need to use this. So I started using it with my students, and I started out with very early level students. Here's the first exercise in it, which, as you can see, would not be notes that a young first-time student would be reading, which is all right. They own the book. I show it to them, and then I show how to play it. And it's very easy to follow because they just do the same thing on every key. So this is the first exercise is called alternating arm drops on octaves. Of course, I never say that. I just simply do it. And we talk about an elephant, and you can see this elephant here, which a little boy has drawn, because I try to show this as a kind of a storyline. So, for example, first we have the elephant who comes and stomps around very heavily. He's really fat. And then I tell them, elephants love to roll in the mud. And they go, ooh. Yes, they love to roll in the mud. It cools them off. It makes them feel wonderful. And what they pick up in the mud is a whole bunch of little critters that then are on the back in the mud. And it may happen that there's a bird that is flying by and says, look at that elephant. I see lots of little critters there. That looks like lunch to me. And so they come onto the elephant, sit on his back, and they peck like this to find their lunch. So by the fact of the elephant being so fat and heavy and the little birds being so small, a lot can be communicated with a few simple notes. This book depends on patterns like this. As you see in the beginning, it was just a half a measure. The number 2, it's a full measure. Then you might have 4 measure patterns. So let's see. Here's another 1 measure pattern that is really nice. And again, it looks like a pretty complicated rhythm to be used, but I just borrow a page from my friend Peter Mack's fruit scale book, and I just call it Huckleberry Apple Pumpkin Pie. And on down the scale. Number 2, of course, introduces the dread triplet. Well, never mind. We're not going to explain what a triplet is. We're just going to call it strawberry. And I think we could call this strawberry ice cream cake. Later on, the patterns become larger, longer, and the elements that we've seen in earlier parts of the book get reused in different ways. So remember, this was, of course, a waltz bass. So then later, you're going to see that incorporated into a one-hand figure. And I add the articulation myself, as you can see. Chromatic scales are like double thirds. They seem very hard to do unless you love them. And it seems like all kids love to play chromatic scales. So it's not really that difficult to introduce it. Hazel Cobb does it in several steps. And now we're nearing the end of the book. So she's going to give us a full chromatic scale with a waltz bass. And here's how it sounds. And so on. Now, number 2, of course, is for the left hand. So the chromatic scale is the same, except in contrary motion, but the chords are a little different, which is a nice change. Those octave leaps are also a fun thing to do. I think everybody enjoys those. So that's a Hazel Cobb Technique Builders. I highly recommend it. I think you'll really enjoy using it, and your students will like playing from it, and they'll be building their technique. Now, speaking of exercises that others have created for us, we can't ignore Mr. Hanon. I kind of grew up with a little bias against Hanon for various reasons, and I avoided it for a long time, even though I knew that it was important and very helpful. Then I got a present from another teacher friend of mine, and that really changed my life. It's a book which is made by Orville Lindquist, and it includes the first 12 exercises of Hanon. And basically, Mr. Lindquist has done something that you and I could do too, but maybe we didn't, or we don't want to take the time to do. So I use his ideas. He has made for each exercise a set of variants using different rhythms, using different combinations, sometimes different intervals and articulation. And so, for example, as you can see here, you have and so on, and from the top, etc. Now, the B, C, and D part all get their impetus from a couple of 16th notes and a couple of 8th notes, just arranged in different patterns, so that you would have, or you might in the next one have, and then finally, and so on. Now, also, I think you can see that number E is quite a challenging one. And I have the students keep track of their metronome marks on these, and because I want them to see how much they improve over time. But I always tell them, when you get to E, you might want to turn that metronome down. So for example, this one is, so that takes a lot of coordination and a lot of explanation too, to keep them safe while they're doing that. Then the last one on each page is always identified as the exercise for the weak fingers. So you would have something like this, for example. And of course, on the way down, you'd be challenging the left hand. And so on. So that it's kind of fun to do. And by the way, the big problem on that one is getting them to do the repetitions correctly. So we usually circle each group and analyze it. The first group is a scale without a note. Okay, missing a note. The second group is a trill. The third group is a trill. And the last one is a scale not missing any notes. Okay, so even so, sometimes it comes back weird. Like, why wouldn't you count that? Anyway, that's life. That's life in the piano studio. You know about that. After the students go through the book, the Lindquist book, and do their 12 exercises with the variants, we go back and do it again in different keys. So on every page with the original exercise, Lindquist will suggest, for example, practice also in the keys of F, G, and D, which they do. Then third time around. Okay, so now I say, well, you know what? Mr. Hanon wrote hundreds of these exercises. And if you'd like to advance to the older ones, let's go for it. Let's do 13, etc. Now, we don't have Mr. Lindquist with us anymore. So you're going to have to write your own variants. Okay, and so that's what they do. Now, I want to show you a couple examples of that. Here are two from an 8 and 9-year-old. This 8-year-old on the left is obviously somebody who's 8 going on 25. Just amazing sort of approach to everything. Anyhow, you can see that she wrote out one measure of each exercise, which is in 3/4, and then she writes the one measure from the top. And then she turns around those rhythms a little bit. You can see in the second one, she puts the 16ths in the middle. Third one, she puts the 16ths at the end. And so again, she's following that sort of principle of varying the variant. Then on letter D, she comes up with a different rhythm and recognizes that that should be in 4/4. So there it is. Which is kind of nice. And then she fools around with that a little bit. Then also on F, what she decides is the way to finish this up is with double thirds. She's recognized that the exercise is built on double thirds. So now she is. Now, the student on the right is obviously a very different personality. This looks just like total chicken scratch. I agree. But actually, I was able to decipher it, and I don't require that everybody make a neat package. They can do it any way they want as long as I can understand it. So you see a couple of different rhythms in A and B. In C, what I gleaned from that was that he wants one hand to play legato and the other to play staccato, which is a good idea. On D, he marks one hand pianissimo and the other hand fortissimo. Also excellent practice advice. Then you can see at the end, he even does include a third in it. It's kind of it's kind of messed up, but it's there. So he saw the potential for thirds as well. Here's another student who took a different tack on it. So now he is borrowing the idea from one of my practice tips on rhythms, you know, the traditional practice this in different rhythms. I notate it in dots and dashes because my belief is that we should stay as long as we can on the long note so that we plan carefully and then play as fast as the speed of light on the fast notes. So he has used that. You can see that in A, he has a rhythm of, and then he turns it around for B. C and D, he puts NA, which I guess means not applicable. Or maybe I think I know what it is. I think that he does not want to use the metronome on that one. Maybe the rhythm was too difficult for that, which I think that's good thinking. You can see that he has kept his metronome marks, his keep track 100, 102, 104, and so on. But he elected not to use the metronome on C and D. In E, he's done something which he also learned from Lindquist, who sometimes would ask us to play. It was a nice idea to use the different sense of anywhere you like, in sixths or in tenths or even in thirds. And so he utilizes that in his E. And then he also uses double thirds, which I think is, again, a tribute to double thirds. Kids really like double thirds. All right. Now, I would like next to give you a little bit of an introduction to something that is now part of our third category, which is technical regimens. This gentleman is named Alexander Peskanov. He's a man who grew up in Odessa in the Russian system, and as such, of course, became a fabulous technician because he would be put out of the music school if he didn't pass his exam in technique at the end of every year. He came to the US to study at Juilliard, and he discovered that in this country we have all different ways of looking at technique, and some people don't look at it at all. And he was, of course, shocked. Welcome to the US, that's how it is here. Anyway, Mr. Peskanov decided to do a kind of a codification of the Russian system he'd grown up in, and to put it into a form that could be nicely used by teachers and students in America. And this is the manual that he produced, and there are books for each of the different skills that it includes. Now, he calls the event Piano Olympics, which is kind of cute. It's not a competitive event, but it is a very, very serious and important event, and we do it every year. It takes all day long. In ordinary times, he comes down from Long Island to Washington and sits with us all day and listens to the students do their technical regimen and comments and helps them and so on. It's a really grand event. This year, of course, he had earphones on because he stayed home. I was surprised that it worked really well. Actually, I'll tell you something else that surprised me, and that is I discovered there is one good thing about COVID, and that is the technique attention. When we started doing this last March, probably like you, I said to myself, well, this will be a disaster. I'll never be able to hear nuances in my students playing. I'll never be able to actually comment on important subtleties. So I guess what I'll do is just load on the technique. They can do mechanical things and whatever, we'll see how it works. Well, surprisingly, it worked great. I mean, actually, they really like it. They're doing way more technical etudes and exercises than I ordinarily would give. But it's been a really good experiment, and they've learned a lot from it. And I don't know what I'm going to do when we get out of this, but that's another story. Anyway, they've learned a little less repertoire, but also what they do in technique helps them to learn the repertoire faster. So that's something else to think about. Now, when I tell you about this Piano Olympics regimen, I want to show you what it involves over the long haul. And this is one of the reasons that I think it's so great, which is that, again, as I said, I practiced, probably like you, scales and arpeggios growing up, but there's a lot of technical routine that I did not practice. And this system, little by little, adds pretty much all the building blocks that actually occur in our pieces. Also, there's an emphasis on the musical side of it, so that basically we're always encouraging ourselves to use dynamics, to group notes in musical systems like fours or threes or sixes. And it's a very, very gradual process. So what you see on the top is the different levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Some of them take more than a year to cover. So I would say this is, I don't know, 7 to 10 years of piano, really. So it's not something you just dump on people. You add little tiny bits at a time. So the scales in the first levels, just a single octave scale, broken chords in inversions, chromatic scales, hand separate even, and block chords. So very simple, and just the easy keys, C, G, D, A, and E. Okay, so the thing that I really appreciate about this system is that there are add-ons as you go. It's also fun to graduate, to have a student feel like they can graduate from level 1 to level 2. Everybody likes to graduate. And in in studying piano, it's usually like, oh, I'll never finish this. I can never practice enough. I can never do enough years of work. Anyway, so this is a nice aspect of it. Now, for example, with the scale, okay? So from the single note scale, we go to 4 octaves, we go to hands together, we go to major, minor, and so on. But eventually, little by little, we keep adding these different keys, and then we add little tails, I call it scales with tails, in between the scales so that they can go from, let's say, from C major to its relative minor, A minor, and then to the next major key down, which is F major, and its relative minor, and so on. So the scales with tails, just using it to show the scale. Suppose I'm coming down in C, then I go up 1 note, and then here I am at A minor. Now, that was the same key signature, but in my next key, I have a flat. So now I go up a half step, and now I'm in F major. And that's how the scales with tails work. And I'd like to show you an example of somebody who's been doing this for a long time, like 4 or 5 years. So, but I want you to see how fun it is when you actually get this put together. So you can start putting them together in, any sort of order, 2, 4, 6, 8, like that. When I do my warm-ups, I do the 24 keys. It takes about, I don't know, 6 minutes or something like that. And I think by this level, this boy is doing probably 4 pairs. So here's an illustration of that for you. Here's an example of the broken chords, just major and minor. This girl is not a beginner, but she is a newcomer to Piano Olympics. So she shows an early level of this. And here we have our arpeggios, major and minor, early level. The next boy is going to show you the other kind of broken chords. I mean, this occurs a lot in literature, especially classical literature, and it's not really that easy to play. So I'm happy that it's included in this regimen. Now he's also beginning to add chords to the major minor. So you're going to hear him play major, minor, and what I call flat six. So let's listen to this one. Over a period of time, we add actually 10 more chords to the original major chord. And here's somebody who's going to show you how that works with arpeggio. So he's playing one arpeggio from each of 11 chords. And this is kind of like if you if you know the last etude of Chopin, this is kind of what he does, really. Here we go. What's nice about this is it's really interesting to do. And, you know, when we have the Piano Olympics, I always put the very advanced students in with the young ones, and the parents are all there. So everybody sees where they're going with this. It keeps them involved. And that really, really matters over the years, as I'm sure you will agree. Here's a diagram of what you just heard. I think he played it in D, but here's how it would work. So you have your major, your minor, the sixth chord of the minor, then the regular sixth chord of the major, then the four chord, make it minor, diminished seventh, major minor seven from C, from A flat, from F, the four, and finally from two, and back to the tonic. You get a tremendous sense of accomplishment when you can do that. And you apply this to all the different chord elements, broken chords, Russian broken chords, block chords, and of course, arpeggios. There is one element that I have added to this myself because the trill is not really included in the Piano Olympics. Now, I don't know about you, but I have never met a professional pianist who said, I have a great trill. Usually we're so embarrassed about our trill. Oh, I wish I could trill faster. I wish I could trill with these different fingers and so on. So when I was growing up, I had a trill exercise that was helpful, but you know, had a kind of a drawback, because what we did was we trilled on each note of the scale with a finger that belonged on the scale. So that gave us practice for all the fingers, which was good. What wasn't good about that is that it didn't acknowledge that some fingers usually trill better than others. So your speed was determined by how fast you could do 4 and 5. So what I decided to do was just kind of come right out and admit, okay, some fingers don't trill as well as others. We're going to deal with it. And this is how we deal with it. Basically, this is an early version, and I'm going to show you somebody completing it. So we trill with 1, 2, 1, 3, 2, 3, 2, 4. And those are all in multiples of 4 with the metronome. Then, getting to the weaker fingers, we switch to multiples of 3. And I have found that this ratio works in 99% of the cases, that what they can, at their highest trill of the stronger fingers, they can keep up with the weaker fingers as long as they observe this ratio. So let me show you an example of someone who's going to do it without the whole notes. Now, I have all different versions of this because I started with really little kids, even in eighth notes. But he's going to do sort of the final version and show you what happens. As you can see, we use the same fingering in each hand. So one goes one way and one goes the other. Also, I never put hands together on this. Again, acknowledging that normally one hand will be a better triller than the other, and to enable each one to go as high as it possibly can. Now we come to the category of etudes. And this does not have to be the ultimate Chopin, Debussy list. It can start at a very, very early age. And I want to suggest an option for that. This is a photograph of the covers of these beautiful books. There are actually 3 altogether, of a series called The Russian School of Piano Playing. You know, it's an old-fashioned book. The format isn't that great. There are no pictures. The notes are a little smaller than little kids are used to. I will tell you, though, that you cannot find a more beautiful set of repertoire. Most of these are based on Russian folk songs or folk songs from other ethnic areas around Russia. And they're really beautiful. And what I find is when my students play these, they play much more musically than they do when they're playing other things. It does move fast. So if I don't have a student who's moving fast also, I just use it as an addendum to, maybe a method book or whatever else I'm looking at the moment. But one nice thing about this series is that from the very beginning, it includes little exercises that help you to play the pieces involved, and also little studies. So for example, here's a really early version. This cute little which of course could be played in any key. And so it lends itself to various different ideas you might have. The same is true of the next one, which is a little study for, 5-finger patterns. Okay, and it goes like this. You could then go and so on. Or you could play it in minor, or you could play it in major and minor. So that's kind of fun to fool around with. This is actually from the second book, so I wanted to show you sort of what happens as time goes on. This is one of my favorites, and we're back to the old double third idea again. This is such a beautiful piece, really, but it's a study for moving around on the piano and for playing the double thirds, and I use pedal with it, so pedal every measure, and it goes like this. Change one note. For the left hand, again, you change one note in the accompanying part and get beautiful harmonies by doing that. And so on. The studies are intermixed with pieces in these sessions, and by the time you get to the third book, which somewhat confusingly is called Book 2, because there are two parts of Book 1. There's a whole section of studies by all these different composers. Czerny, Schitte, Kaikapar, Maikapar, that's a misspelling on my part. Jelinskis, Gedicki, Gurlitt, Lecoupe, and so on. So if you're looking for a variety of composers, this is a really nice idea. You can get all in one, so to speak. I would also like to say put in a word for poor old Mr. Czerny. He has a bad rep too. I don't know if you've had the experience I have many times of meeting somebody at an event and they say, "What do you do?" "Oh, I'm a pianist," or "I'm a teacher." "Oh, I took piano for years." "Oh, Czerny." I mean, talk about a bad rep. It's too bad because actually a lot of what Czerny did is really interesting and very helpful and actually quite fun to play. I think that what saves him is Mr. Germer. So Czerny wrote, as you know, thousands of these studies, and a man named Mr. Germer came along, and I think what he did is he just collected the best, interesting, most musical, most fun pieces to play and put them in a collection. And so that's what I use. And out of all the pieces in the volume 1, which is about, I think, maybe, 50, 60 pieces, there are very few that I don't use on account of their being not very interesting. This is an example of the early pairing that he does between right hand and left hand, where you have, and then the left hand will have the same, but usually a little change. so they learn early that while an etude is something based on a certain skill, there are changes within it, and those need attention. I like the fact that this collection includes a variety of ideas. Again, this is only number 8 in the book, and my student might be in second or third level year of lessons, and so it looks kind of daunting, but what I discovered is that this is the favorite piece that they do, and I usually teach it non-legato, and then just say, oh, do the same thing in the left hand. But it comes out to really sound, I think, lovely at the end. They might have second week they can do it legato or not. And so on. It's a very, very, very pretty piece and very popular among the kids. I like that. Fast scales. This is a very exciting piece, especially when they get to measure 6, which is that old issue of the repetitions. That measure is the bane of my existence, but so we always, take care of it first. But this is such a fun way to start out. And so on. They get a real sense of power from that. And then at the end, the fun part of really makes them feel good. Yeah, these are ornaments, okay? This is a beautiful little one that just simply treats ornaments over and over again so that you have a piece made out of it. And so on. Then it changes a little bit. This is a sort of later version. It's like a 2-page piece, but it makes a very attractive, even recital piece if they want to. We do it. I love this one. I also like the idea that this collection introduces 16th notes and 32nd notes. Kids can learn early that you don't have to play fast when you see a 32nd note. You could play this one very slowly. It's just a matter of math and figuring out the different elements. But if you play it fast, it's really cute. And so on. So that's a fun piece to play. I think that Czerny was very clever with repeated notes. You know how it's a little bit hard to convince young players to change fingers on repeated notes. So Czerny does a very clever thing here by making a leap after the 4th note. So you almost have to put your thumb on it, and very few people actually want to do all these repetitions with the thumb. So it becomes interesting and kind of fluent to do it this way. And then they can learn that skill. And then it even goes to a 7th and back to the 6th. Sorry, back to the 6th and back to a 5th, okay? So they have to calculate all these different spaces on the piano. Then to go full hog, you just simply outline a chord with repeated notes. Okay, which is again not easy to do if you use one finger. So this is a good system for teaching people to sweep off the keys with various different fingers. I like the sound of them. I like how they pull together all these different ideas. Somebody I heard once said that Czerny covers all the cliches of Western music. And maybe that wasn't a very polite way to say it, but it is kind of true. This one's kind of like this will remind you of something else, I think. So triplets. I love the adding the grace notes to it. Makes a very, very nice piece. Also, these are full of dynamics, okay? So that if you can get your students to do it, it really enhances the musical value of the pieces. Before I finish, I would like to mention to you one other thing. Pedaling is something that we don't usually teach. Who knows how to teach pedaling? We can tell our students, you pedal too much, you pedal too little, you kept it too long, it's too deep, it's too whatever. But this book, again, a very old volume, but still in print by Jesse Gaynor, actually does a wonderful thing by putting a rhythm chart, a rhythm line underneath the pedal. So in your very first exercise, you have to figure out what you're going to do on which count, and then you have to count. So you're going to count 1 and 2 and. So of course you're going to lift on as written in the music, 1 and 2 and then you see that your pedal is carrying your sound. You drop on 3, 1, 3 and 4 and so on. So that's a simple scale. Then it occurs in thirds. Then it's nice to put this together into a kind of a harmonic structure. This number 3, for example, is all for the left hand. 1 and 2 and 3 and although I don't have my camera fixed so that you can see my feet, I of course do have them fix it that way when they're playing this, so I can see exactly when the foot goes down. This book is also very nice musically. Here's an example of a later piece, this one in 6/8, so you can see this is more complex. You have to count your 6 counts, put your foot down on 2, the second note of the first group, and then on 5, the second note of the second group. Yeah, so this is not just an exercise. This is really a lovely piece, and you have to use a pedal with it. Here's another example from, I think this is near the end of the book. Pretty complicated. So you have various different voices here, and you even change hands in the melody. But you see how carefully that's notated, so that if you actually follow that, everything is going to turn out perfectly. And it's a marvelous way of showing people that if you are careful, that if you calculate and if you count, your pedaling can be absolutely professional. And you can have a good time playing it too. I hope that some of these ideas keep your students from looking like this, and maybe even end up having a couple look like this. Thank you very much for being here with me.